welcome to English Class Collective. I'm Alex.
And I'm Lucas. Today we're going to talk about something that many English learners experience, feeling scared to speak English.
That's right. We know this is a really common problem, and we want to help you feel more confident when speaking English.
In today's episode, we'll share some practical tips and personal experiences about overcoming this fear. We'll also teach you some useful vocabulary and expressions along the way.
Before we start, make sure to check out the vocabulary list in the video description. You'll find all the important words and phrases we use in this episode.
We'll break everything down into simple, easy-to-understand parts, and we'll have some practice questions to help you remember what you've learned.
You know, Lucas, one of the most common things I hear from our listeners is that they freeze up when they need to speak English, especially with native speakers.
Oh yes, I've heard this too. It's what we call speaking anxiety, and it's completely normal. When you're learning a new language, it's natural to feel nervous or self-conscious.
Exactly. And one thing I always tell my students is that making mistakes is actually part of the learning process. There's no need to feel embarrassed about them.
That's such an important point, Alex. I remember when I was learning Spanish, I would get so worried about using the wrong words that sometimes I wouldn't speak at all.
That's what we call being tongue-tied, when you want to speak but feel like you can't get the words out. What helped you overcome that feeling?
Well, I started with small steps. Instead of trying to have long conversations right away, I began with simple exchanges, like ordering coffee or asking for directions.
That's a great strategy. It's all about building confidence gradually. Another tip I often share is to practice with a language partner or join conversation groups where everyone is learning.
Yes, and these days there are so many online communities where you can practice speaking English in a supportive environment. It's much less intimidating than jumping straight into conversations with native speakers.
Absolutely. And remember, most native English speakers are very patient and understanding. They appreciate it when someone is making an effort to learn their language.
That's true. Sometimes learners put too much pressure on themselves to speak perfectly, but communication is more important than perfection.
I love that phrase, communication over perfection. It's really what language learning is all about. Would you say that's been your experience with language learners?
Definitely. The students who make the most progress are often the ones who aren't afraid to make mistakes. They just keep trying, keep practicing, and eventually speaking becomes more natural.
Now, let's review some of the key vocabulary and expressions we used in our conversation. These will really help you talk about speaking anxiety.
The first phrase we used was to freeze up. This means to become suddenly unable to move or speak because of fear or nervousness. For example, I froze up when my teacher asked me a question in English.
Next, we have speaking anxiety. This is the nervous feeling you get when you need to speak in another language, like many students experience speaking anxiety during presentations.
We also used self-conscious, which means feeling uncomfortable or embarrassed about yourself. For example, don't feel self-conscious about your accent.
Then there's tongue-tied, when you're so nervous that you have trouble speaking. As in, I got tongue-tied when trying to introduce myself in English.
Another useful phrase is to build confidence, which means to become more sure of yourself gradually. For example, regular practice helps you build confidence in speaking English.
And finally, supportive environment, a place or situation where people help and encourage you. Like, our conversation group provides a supportive environment for practicing English.
These words and phrases will help you talk about your own language learning experience and feelings about speaking English.
Let's check how well you understood our first conversation. We'll ask you 2 questions and then give you the answers. Remember, you can pause the audio if you need more time to think.
Question 1. What are 2 main reasons why people feel scared to speak English? Think about it.
Bimon, the answer is fear of making mistakes and worry about what others will think of their accent or pronunciation.
Question 2. What was the first practical tip we suggested for overcoming speaking anxiety? Take a moment to recall.
Yay. The answer is start practicing in small, comfortable situations, like talking to yourself in the mirror or recording voice messages on your phone.
How did you do? Remember, you can always go back and listen to the conversation again if you missed anything.
You know, Lucas, I actually have a really interesting personal story about feeling scared to speak English. When I first started teaching, I met this amazing student from Japan named May.
Oh, tell us more about that. What was her experience like?
Well, May was incredibly smart and knew so much English grammar, but she would barely speak in class. She told me she felt paralyzed with fear whenever she had to talk to native speakers.
That sounds really tough. How did she overcome it?
She did something really clever. She started working at a local coffee shop where she had to take orders in English. At first, it was terrifying for her, but the interactions were short and repetitive.
That's such a smart approach. It's like exposure therapy, isn't it? Starting with small, manageable conversations.
Exactly. And after a few months, her confidence skyrocketed. She told me that making the same small mistakes over and over actually helped her realize that nobody really cared about those tiny errors.
I had a similar experience with a friend from Brazil. He used to be really self-conscious about his accent, but then he joined an English-speaking hiking group.
That's another great example. How did that work out for him?
Well, when you're climbing a mountain together, nobody cares about perfect grammar. He said that having a shared activity made the language feel less important than the experience they were sharing.
That's such a valuable point. Finding situations where English is just the tool, not the main focus.
Absolutely. And you know what else helped him? He started using what we call filler phrases. You know, things like, well, let me think about that, or that's an interesting question.
Those phrases are so useful. They give you time to think without awkward silences. I often tell my students that native speakers use these all the time too.
And they make you sound more natural. I remember him saying that once he learned these phrases, he felt more confident because he could keep conversations flowing more smoothly.
These real-life examples really show that everyone struggles with speaking anxiety at first, but there are so many creative ways to overcome it. Now, let's review some of the useful vocabulary and expressions that came up in our conversation.
The first one is exposure therapy. This means gradually facing your fears in small steps until they become less scary.
Right. Like in our example, starting a new job was like exposure therapy for improving my English.
Next, we have to skyrocket, which means to increase very quickly and dramatically.
Here's how to use it. Her confidence skyrocketed after just a few weeks of practice.
We also talked about being self-conscious, when you worry too much about what others think of you.
For example, many language learners feel self-conscious about their accent.
Another useful phrase we used was filler phrases. These are expressions we use to give ourselves time to think.
Yes, like when you say, well, let me think about that, or that's an interesting question.
We also use the phrase to overcome, which means to successfully deal with a problem or difficulty.
As in, she managed to overcome her fear of speaking English by practicing every day. Okay, let's check your understanding of what we just talked about. Remember, you can pause the audio at any time to think about your answers.
Here's question number 1. What was Sarah's main strategy for overcoming her fear of speaking English at work?
The answer is that she used exposure therapy, starting with small conversations and gradually working up to longer ones.
And here's question number 2. According to our discussion, what happened to Maria's confidence after she started using filler phrases?
The answer is that her confidence skyrocketed because she didn't feel pressured to speak perfectly all the time.
Don't worry if you didn't get both answers right away. You can always go back and listen to that section again.
That's right. Take your time and pause whenever you need to. It's all about learning at your own pace. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today about feeling scared to speak English.
We really have. Let's quickly recap the main points we discussed.
First, remember that feeling nervous about speaking English is completely normal. Even advanced learners sometimes feel this way.
Exactly. And we learned about some really practical strategies, like starting with small conversations and using those helpful filler phrases.
Don't forget about the power of practice partners. Finding someone you trust to practice with can make a huge difference.
We also heard some inspiring stories from other English learners who overcame their fears, just like Sarah and Maria.
The key takeaway is that everyone can improve their speaking confidence. It just takes time and patience.
And remember, Making mistakes is part of the learning process. Native speakers make mistakes too.
Before we go, we want you to know that you're not alone on this journey. Keep practicing, stay positive, and be patient with yourself.
That's right. Join us next time when we'll be talking about another interesting topic for English learners.
Until then, keep practicing and stay confident.